I'm here on behalf of the SIMNA Sydney Organising Committee. So for those that haven't heard about SIMNA or don't know much about it, SIMNA was established in 2012, and its purpose has been to foster, share knowledge, and emerging practice of social impact measurement in Australia. So the organisation aims to identify and promote best practice on impact measurement and improve social outcomes in the wider community through learning and also capacity building. So SIMNA members, they benefit from a range of resources as we are connected across an international network to other 45 countries. And as you might know, social impact measurement is increasingly a part of social purpose programs. And today, the need to measure social impact is more critical than ever before. With the growing number of what we call the wicked problems and limited funding, organizations need to understand and show that they are driving positive change. So if I'm passionate about measuring and prioritizing social outcomes, or if you're just curious about SIMNA, join us. We have some slides there, and Eleanor is our chair. So come and just talk to us.
So just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. Just as we know, this is a blended environment, so we have a number of people on the line as well as those in the room today. We will have some set questions for our panellists, and we have some panellists on the line as well as in the room today. And then we will throw open to both in-room and online questions. If I can ask everyone online to stay on mute, you'll probably notice that some of our team will mute you if you don't, but please just pop your question in the chat. We do have Eleanor here who will be monitoring the chat and who will feed those questions back to us, and we'll give you an opportunity to elaborate on those questions as well, if need be. And then I think the other components is obviously for those of you in the room, emergency, please proceed out this way and follow the exit signs. Bathrooms are located down there too, and some of you would have seen those, but there is a concierge there that you can ask if you're confused. And we do have some drinks and refreshments after as well, so please feel free to stay for those too. So we might get underway to doing some of the introductions for our panellists. So we're very fortunate to have two panellists, as I mentioned, in the room today. We have Associate Professor Ann Dadich, and we have Dr Catherine Kaplun. So thank you both so much for joining. Associate Professor Ann Dadich is affiliated with the Western Sydney University School of Business. She's also a registered psychologist, and she's a full member of the Australian Psychological Society. Anne has an extensive publication record, over 190 refereed publications, alongside a track record of research grants and awards with expertise in resilience in children and families. And we're really excited to hear from you today, Anne, and to learn from your experience. We also have Dr Catherine Kaplun here with us today, who has over 15 years experience working in the health and education sectors with families and children, mainly when circumstances are tough. Kathy's research recognises the strengths and capacities of families and communities, and looks at the resources needed in the provision of children's health, development, learning and wellbeing. So thank you both so much for joining us. On the line, and I might just ask for my team member to stop screen sharing so we can see our presenters. We also have Molly. Now, and apologies from Dr Robert Carr, who was to join us today. Unfortunately, Robert's unwell, but we do have Molly on the line. And I'll just see if we can spotlight you, Molly. But perhaps, Molly, could you come off mute and just say hello so that we can see you? While Molly's doing that, Molly is the Director of Program Design and Coordination. She has experience in she's an experienced public sector leader who's worked in policy development, strategy development and implementation, and she works for Resilience New South Wales. So we're really excited to hear from Molly on this very important topic. And we also have Skye. Skye, are you on the line and can you hear us? Skye, did you want to come off mute so that you can say hello too? We can see you now. So we also have Skye Trudgett, who is the CEO of Kowa Collaboration. Skye, can you hear us?
She is muted.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, it's dodgy internet.
That's okay. So Skye is specialises in First Nations led design of evaluation work broadly, and in data sovereignty. She's a First Nations researcher and she's contributed to numerous evaluations and leads a team of evaluators. And we're really excited to hear from Skye today as well. So we might.
I think Molly just.
Okay, Molly, can you hear us? Molly, if you'd like to come off mute and we've just introduced you, but I'm not sure that you can hear us.
Can hear you. I'm so sorry to be late. I'm multitasking. Hi, Molly Tregoning from Resilience New South Wales. Standing in, I'm sure not as fabulous as Rob Carr, but I will be standing in for him today as he's unwell. So thank you very much for having me at the very last minute.
Thank you so much for joining, Molly. So we might get into some of the questions for today and I'll hand over to Paula to ask the first.
Thank you. So just before I do ask the first question, I've done some research on resilience, and the term resilience can be traced back to the Latin resilire, so if I say it right, and simply means jumping back or rebounding. So nowadays, the word resilience is used everywhere and in different contexts. Often is used in ways that drain it of meaning and link it to vague concepts like character. So when the terms apply to individuals, usually place all the burden of success or failure on a person's character. But resilience doesn't have to be an empty or vague concept. In fact, decades of research have revealed that resilience is ultimately a set of skills that can be taught. So resilience is also a dynamic process consisted of a series of ongoing reciprocal transactions between the individual, the environment, and community. So this is my take, but I would like to hear from the panelists here today. How do you view resilience and apply it in your area of work? Wants to have a go with that?
So at the start, I'll kick off. Okay, so I work in TEACH, which is the Transforming Early Childhood and Education Research Centre at Western Sydney University. So we link very closely with what SIMNA is doing, where we look at social outcomes around children's development, learning and wellbeing. So in implying resilience in that, obviously what we want for children is the best possible start to life so they can grow up strong, they're healthy and they're going well. They're on a really healthy trajectory, I guess, to be strong adults, to be, you know, participating in the culture and the social and civic duties in the country. So in doing all of that and putting all that together, we look at very, very many aspects in the early childhood development period of 0 to 8 years, but we also look across the lifespan at how those factors impact in adolescence and then in later adulthood. So it's complex, put it that way. And so, yeah, resilience in that space can mean many, many things, but we look at what's happening in early childhood, tracking that over time, looking at the implications of that for later life, and then looking back, if you like, in that resilience framework of trying to see when is a critical time when we need to intervene? When can we make the biggest difference in children's lives to make things better? And what's that point and what do we need to put around children and families to make them stronger and healthier and put all those things in place so they are on a resilient pathway, if you like. But that's me.
Thank you.
Could I just add to that? And I was saying, although we have some definitions to be guided by with regard to resilience, I think the jury is still out about crystallising exactly what it is and the parameters that define what it is and not. I guess one of the criticisms in this space is that it's often individualised. It's often done with a view that we look at resilience from the individual's perspective. Helpful, but also limiting because we're pathologising the individual, whereby we're saying, if you're not resilient, what are you? You're less than and you're weak, and perhaps the interventions need to be tailored to you as an individual. There is obviously progressive approaches in resilience, and I think there needs to be a lot more, of course, but that there are those approaches more progressive that are recognising resilience as community-based social resilience, and I think you're bound to have, with regard to your interventions broadly defined, bang for buck, because we know about the reinforcing that you can garner through having strategies that are multifaceted, that don't just pathologise individuals and say there's something wrong with them. But yeah, there are indeed progressive understandings of resilience.
Okay, thank you. And Skye and Molly, what are your view? How do you view resilience, and how does it apply to your work? Hi, Skye, do you want to?
I'm going to mute myself first.
Okay.
And so, well, first of all, the organisation that I work for is called Resilience New South Wales, which is not the most important thing about it, but it does mean that we think about the concept and how we can help embed it in people we work with and communities we work with a lot. I really liked the introduction about the meaning of resilience, and one of the things I think that is sort of missing, I guess, is resilience being around people or communities or structures or whatever it is, bouncing back and returning to where they were before. What we try to do in the work that we do at Resilience New South Wales is to help people and communities to recover and be better, more prepared, more ready, more understanding of the risks than they were before the disaster. So it's sort of, I don't know if it's resilience plus or what it is, but going back to where we were before doesn't feel like enough. It's making sure that people are more prepared for what comes next. And specifically at Resilience, we focus on recovery from disasters, which are sometimes called natural disasters. But I think regardless of whether we're thinking about being better post-event or resilience, then a lot of what we do and a lot of what we think about when we're working with communities is what particular communities need, what their priorities are, and how we can, with the fairly, let's be honest, generic or blunt instruments that government often has to offer, how can we make them support and facilitate that recovery that is genuinely community-led? And some of the ways we do that is to simply support financially community organisations and individuals within communities to lead that work, so that people who have been through a disaster can see their neighbours or someone they know or someone they trust working with them as they walk through that recovery journey. I'll stop talking now so that we can hear from Skye as well.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, everyone. So I think from my perspective, it's quite similar to what the ladies were saying before. A lot of the work that we look at is the resilience of First Nations peoples and communities, most specifically, I guess, off the back of colonisation itself, and then the effects that have continued thereafter. But we kind of look more from what are the things that build resilience within our communities and across our communities. And a lot of that work is done by our local Aboriginal community controlled organisations, but there's also kinds of different efforts that are done by broader cross-cultural orgs, but also individuals who are kind of focusing on things like connecting to community and culture, connecting to place, and ideas around place making as building resilience for a whole community. So there's different things like that that we kind of look at in different ways. So Molly, you kind of touched on some of the tools, but sometimes we would look at things from more of a story or a sharing aspect, as opposed to just standard instruments alone. I think resilience is a very complex kind of topic, and so it needs multiple layers to understand it in different ways. So we try a few different things.
That's a really good point, Skye, around it being complex, and it sort of leads nicely to our next question, which was around thinking about how we can better define and understand resilience in different contexts and for different places and people. Molly, I know that you and your team do a lot of this work day to day in terms of actually supporting building resilience. But how do you think about it and how do you define it? What tools do you use in your work?
One of the ways that I think about it and that I encourage the people I work with to think about it is to essentially, it sounds a bit defeatist, but to make ourselves redundant. So by providing relevant, applicable and tailored tools, programs, supports, whatever else it is, to communities who are recovering, and supporting them to take the lead on that themselves to the extent that they need that support. And in some cases, they really don't. In some cases, it's more about getting out of the way. But in a lot of cases, it's about providing support through finance, through navigating bureaucracy and regulation and those sorts of things, and making that easier to navigate for people. It's also a lot about and this is a pretty intangible but really important thing. It's about knitting together the various offerings that are across government that can help support people to recover from a disaster, but that people don't often see as being joined up or knitted together. So as I'm talking to you, I'm sitting in a very large public space in the Northern Rivers, where we've got a lot of government agencies all physically sitting together and sitting down with individual people who need support and talking through case by case what we can do for them. And that is, not a revolutionary idea, but we have seen through the experience of other agencies and individuals through previous events that really the time taken, the personalised discussions, the ability to access a range of services all at one time without it being really bureaucratically onerous is really important for people who've had pretty much everything else taken away from them. So that's something that we are trying to do more and more, is to think a lot more about what it feels like to be an individual who is seeking support, rather than what it feels like to be a bureaucrat who needs to deliver on a particular commitment or a particular need. Sometimes we're more successful at that than others, but we're always, that's what we're trying to learn to do better and better, whether it's through the design of the program or whether it's through how it's delivered, or if it's just about how we talk to our customers and our colleagues.
And did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there are so many great tools in the evaluator's toolbox to use to ensure that what you're doing is fit for purpose, depending on what you're trying to evaluate. But I think a common denominator, and not to critique too greatly these great tools, I think a common denominator you often find among these tools in your toolbox is that they have a very pathologizing approach. I have a negative approach. What's wrong? What's the issue? What's the gap? What's the problem? What adverse events have happened? In my program of work, I have a particular focus on what's brilliant. So pockets of brilliance in our health and mental health services. And the conversations I have are often around, what are you proud of? What makes your heart sing? What brings you joy? Despite the myriad problems, your time poor, your resource poor, your funding poor, how does this happen? How do the stars align? That doesn't magically happen. And trying to understand those answers to those questions, I think, can be incredibly energising and can be affirming of the great work that people are doing despite the adversity. Now, this is not a Pollyanna-ish approach by any means. This is not about ignoring the elephants in the room. But what I find is having that conversation starter, that first question can sort of set the tone for the conversation, and people know that I'm legitimately interested in what they're proud of, and I'm not there to find out about the elephants in the room or the skeletons in their closet, because more often than not, when they understand I'm a researcher, they jump 6 feet back and think, oh my God, she's here to find out their deep, dark organisational secrets, where indeed they talk about that stuff of their own volition. because there's a sense of psychological safety in the space, because they know that my primary focus is what they're proud of, what makes their heart sing. But inadvertently, they talk about the elephants in the room because they want to understand how to manage those, but of their own volition, not something that I directed, not something that I'm saying you need to change your practices around X, Y, Z. So I think we need to rethink the conversation starters. We need to rethink the framing of these evaluation tools. As great as I'm not ignoring the importance of identifying problems, I'm not ignoring that by any means, but I think we need to redress our preoccupation with all that's negative with what's positive as well. You know, what's going well, and understanding how those stars align, because it doesn't just magically happen.
Yeah, I think I can add a little bit more to what Anne's saying, and I guess it's a different space that we're working in too, Molly, because obviously you're in that immediate crisis situation. We're looking at families that are probably living in adversity, dealing with their daily crisis as well, but not, I guess, an imminent sort of crisis in that sort of same frame. So I guess it's a slightly different context. But definitely we'd be looking at, you know, the co-design or the participatory sort of thing of actually, you know, and it's interesting because we often start with a needs assessment, you know, what is it that you need? But in actual fact, you know, from the research, we know that looking at the strengths that families have, looking at the resources that they have within their families or within their support networks is actually a better place to start, better to look at what's actually sitting there that they can actually draw on straight away. And start to look at the positive, really, to get out of that. And if you've experienced anything like that yourself, you know that often sitting and thinking about what's not working, you know, all those sort of negative things that come into your head, it's the light at the end of the tunnel or the golden moment or somebody saying something to you, have you thought about this, that might shift your thinking out of that stage and get you moving and changing and adapting to what's happening to you at that point in time. And that's what we're hoping for in dealing with adversity or anything that they really take that's difficult. It's how do we get from here to where we want to be? We don't want to be always in that space. So it's very, I guess, philosophical in a way, but I guess that's where we come from as human beings. We are social beings. We want to be connected and we want to be better. So we strive for that. Yeah.
Could I just add, so in a related concept, I guess, to what we're talking about, the concept that people might be familiar with, positive deviance. So the people that positively deviate from the norms, you expect them to stuff up, you expect them to experience adversity, you expect them to not fare so well, you have low expectations, but every now and then you find these pockets of brilliance of people who just deviate from those social norms. You think, how the hell did that happen? What can we learn from those individuals? And I think there's so much local expertise that we don't pay heed to. We often think that we need to do the fixing for people, but more often than not, the expertise is there. We just need to give it the space and to illuminate it and to learn from those experiences. And
I think, you know, Skye, you must have amazing, you know, things to be dealing on, because our Aboriginal families that we deal with have such strength and resilience in that space. You know, if you look at historically what has happened and what, you know, has been put on them in a way and done for them in a way without them being involved. Huge space there for learning from, you know, other organisations and things, I think, and respect in that space. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from Skye to see, you know, what your thoughts are on.
Sorry. I think, like, from my perspective, I agree with what you're saying. A lot of the things that we are looking for is what are the strengths that are already there from a community, family, you know, kind of broader collective space. What are the strengths that are already there that we can scale up or leverage and draw on, like you said, so that everyone, like, we know that, like, through relationality, building the resilience and strengths of a number of people then folds on out into community as well. So, I mean, specifically in terms of an evaluation approach, sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather. My lemon and honey tea is obviously not doing its job. But like, from an evaluation perspective, we use a tool called Impact Yarns, which is really similar, I guess, in some ways to Most Significant Change, But what we do is we ask people to express what's impactful to them, what's the most impactful yarn they've got about, this thing in their life or within their community or what's happening. And it doesn't need to be bad. Often it can be really good, which is how we understand what are the good things that we can draw on. But by listening to people and allowing them to express themselves in whatever way makes sense to them. So I guess that's what is a little bit different. We use photo, video, song, dance, art, meals, anything, whatever way is an individual person's way of expressing themselves and their experience. We draw on that and then kind of come together and use like a community type approach in terms of analysing those or sense making around for that community, what's the most impactful yarn, why is that the case, and what are we going to do about it next? So that's been really helpful for us in a lot of different instances.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So my next question, now that we talked about some tools, I actually want to hear from all of you. What are the challenges and barriers of methods commonly used to evaluate resilience, and how can they be used in a meaningful way? So I might just start with Anne and then work away.
It's a really good question. I appreciate we probably haven't got enough time to unpack some of these challenges, but I suspect there are probably some no-brainers in terms of many of these are not fit for purpose. Often because they're superimposed on a community, for instance, and one way to potentially address that, going back to what Kathy helpfully alluded to earlier, was co-designing some of these strategies with the communities as opposed to superimposing tools that we assume are going to be fit for purpose. And that's not suggesting that we can't find some standardisation or we're limiting comparability, because you can still do that. But it's just about adapting those approaches to ensure that they are fit for purpose. So, for instance, think about the art-based approaches that Skye has alluded to, which I think are fantastic, needless to say, but they can work really well in Indigenous communities, but indeed others. And some of the work that we've done demonstrate that I think people can be surveyed out, interviewed out, and finding innovative, that can be disengaging. And so finding innovative ways, for instance, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through gamifying these approaches, ensuring that it's fit for purpose, potentially through co-designing the approaches.
And I think Molly's touched on some really important points about just having conversations. Really spending time and talking to them. They just want to be heard all the time. They want their voice heard. They want their, whatever's going on heard. And collectively, as researchers, that's what we do. We pull people's voices together and look for the commonalities in those voices. And sometimes, if you're like the outliers, the things that don't fit, why don't they fit? And there's talking about, that sort of positive deviance. Why is that person doing so well when this person's in the same situation? What's the difference there? And so I think, immersing yourself in those contexts sometimes is really just sitting. And I think our Aboriginal communities have a lovely way of just sitting and being and not talking even, just experiencing sometimes what's going on. I'm sure Skye would have a wealth of information around that, but whenever we've worked in those Aboriginal communities with Aboriginal people and just sat and listened, and, it's really, you can learn so much. You can learn so much in that space.
Thank you. Skye? Not sure where to look, but
Sorry. Lots and lots of barriers. I think that sometimes the barriers aren't necessarily like they're barriers, but they can be coming from a good place at times, like an over eagerness to fix and solve problems and just get on with it. And we think that if we just get on with it, then we're building resilience, when in fact, sometimes it takes really unpacking and doing some of the harder work to get down to, well, what are the things that are underpinning the challenge in the first place. I heard a lady speak, this is a couple of years ago, it was around truth-telling work, but it called it reparative humanism. I've always loved the term, but you know, kind of thinking about how do you go through the hard stuff to then repair as a collective kind of group of people to then move forward. So I think sometimes the barrier can just be coming from a good place, but it does, sometimes I think it requires a little bit more, the longer term gain. And I mean, I guess sometimes things need money really quickly, but also sometimes things get stuck in funding cycles that are like, we have these deliverables in this way, in this time, and we're going to build resilience and solve problems now, or, you know, within 3 years you must do it. And sometimes the work actually takes longer. And this is a common problem in lots of spaces, so I'm not naming up anything new, but I think that is also one of the barriers here too. I'm going to pass over to Molly.
Thanks, Skye. Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, it's certainly not unique to government, nor is it unique to NGOs or anything, but those funding cycles and the limitations around short-term funding cycles and deliverables and announceables and those sorts of things, particularly in the space that we operate in, which is post-disaster, it's a difficult balance. I think one of the other balances that we find a challenge is around having a consistent approach across the state, because we're a state agency and we want to make sure that people have got similar opportunities and access to supports no matter where they are, but really thinking about what are the local needs, what are the particular needs of certain communities, and how do we make sure that everybody is able to access those opportunities and navigate them. So we, a few weeks ago, had a standalone session to work through particular grant supports that were available for Aboriginal communities up here on the Northern Rivers, and so it was a specialised session. And someone said to me at one point, you know, if you set this up so that it worked really well for our mob, it would work really well for everyone. But you've set it up. I was quite.
We just lost your sound for a second. Do you mind just repeating? You just said, if you set it up for.
If you set it up so that if you.
And muting her.
Sorry, Molly, you've just been muted again, and it's not us who's doing that. Apologies. Can I ask whoever is muting?
Muting.
No, it's not a person, it's everyone's been blanket muted, so these guys have to take them off. So I think there's a glitch. It's not like a troll out there. Playing with Molly.
Yeah, I feel like it's a big Rob Carr fan, I'd say, you know, who I'm standing in for. It's just like, shut up. Anyway, I'll try and speak quickly, but and it's probably, you know, you don't want to hear this for the third or fourth time, but one of the community members said, design these things and the way you roll them out for our mob, and they will work for everyone. What you've done is you're asking a whole lot of questions that are really relevant to you or to government or whatever else, but they're totally irrelevant and inappropriate for me. And, you know, flip it so that it's, you know, you don't have to do this to tweak it for us. It's, you design it for us. I promise you it'll work for everyone. And that, yeah, it's thinking about those different perspectives and thinking about what they can lend to this whole recovery experience. That doesn't just make it easier for community by community, but makes it easier and more relevant for everyone. I don't know if you've got a comment about that, Skye, but that's really, really stuck with me and yeah, really given me pause for thought in the work that I've done subsequently.
I will just get you off mute too.
Sorry, I don't know if I was to respond to that, but I agree so much with that comment. And I think that is in a lot of spaces. I think the worldviews and knowledges of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities have got a lot to offer for everyone in this country. And so I think we can focus on and draw into some of those knowledges so that we can utilize them in our communities. I know that I'd mentioned placemaking before, and there was something in the chat, and it's something that we're really trying to focus on, not just after crisis kind of recovery stuff, but what is it, like, how is it that Aboriginal communities can lead placemaking in a way that strengthens the whole of community into the future? So really understanding local culture, local traditions, local beliefs and stories, and then how is that centered within the community in different ways? How are we increasing safety? How are we increasing connection to history and to culture for everyone, to really, you know, at the end of the day, build that resilience for the whole community. So again, I think that in terms of tools, we do a lot of deep listening. I know there's another question about measuring outcomes and outputs. And I think sometimes when we have these predefined outcomes and outputs, it's around things like the change that happens for a single person, as opposed to the change that happens for collectives or whole of community, or the change that happens in terms of the way of working or the way of coming together or the way of centering worldviews of First People, to build those things. So I think, yeah, we're looking at the end game as opposed to looking at the steps along the way or the kind of drivers or things that could underpin it. So sometimes I think it's like looking above the surface, but also looking beneath the surface. And I think it's important in this aspect too. I'm going to pass over to the ladies in the room though, because that was a very health related question, and I'm also keen to hear the answer.
I was just thinking about some of the hidden things, I guess, and I think a lot of it really goes back to relationships and building on those relationships. I think when there's, and we go back to those old things about trust and respect, but really when you're coming from that space and you're taking time to connect with people, you're more likely to get the answers. And Anne touched on it a bit before and saying, you know, like people often put their guard up because they're thinking, what is it that you're asking me? How do I provide the right answer here so I get what I need, or, you know, my needs are met or whatever. And if you can break down some of those barriers and really get through to, you know, the grassroots stuff that is happening for people, then you're more likely to hit the nail on the head and provide what they need. And actually, you know, when you're doing it together and they're part of that decision, they're looking at the, you know, the needs assessment is actually defined with them. You know, rather than saying, you know, if you're only looking at this part of the needs and it's actually this part that we really need to be looking at, we're missing half the picture here. So, you know, working with people to define those things actually helps to make sure that we're actually looking at the right spaces when we're doing things. Because it's no good, I can put the greatest program, the greatest service, the greatest whatever in place, but if you need something that's over here, it's not going to meet your needs. You know, it's not, you're not going to hit the nail on the head at all. So I think that's really important to make sure that what we're providing and what we're trying to put in place is actually, you know, what people want. Goes back to, you know, like look at Google and all those really successful companies, and they always say it's the why. You know, look at the why, match these things up, you know, and you hit the nail on the head. So yeah, I go back to those sorts of things. I mean, you're the systems person, Anne.
I think it can be helpful to work with the warm spots, because I appreciate that people are change fatigued, and often I find it helpful to go to the warm spots. So in terms of if people are receptive to working with you and working with them first, and it seems to be a bit of a no-brainer, but then I find that those successes that you experience together then become the flames to which other moths are attracted to. How can I get in on this? How can I get on the action? How can I be involved? As opposed to, and I'm sure we've seen this time and time again, where we've got reforms just rolled out with limited, if any, consultation, and sort of people are pulled along as the reluctant participants in that change process. This obviously has relevance to evaluation, because evaluation is often part of those change efforts. But I think going where the warm spots are can be helpful to work with people, as opposed to whereby we are seeing change superimposed on teams, communities, if not individuals. And I guess there's nothing like a crisis. I'm thinking about COVID and indeed others, you know, and fires, floods, you name it, to demonstrate the strength or not of the trust of those relationships, whereby, you know, if directives are rolled out, you know, are people saying how high, or are are people reluctant? I think that demonstrates how much trust there is in a relationship. But we don't want to be getting to the crisis stage before we are able to, before we're answering questions for the first time, what's likely to work in this community. We want to know that beforehand, and having those relationships established way before the next crisis, the next pandemic, the next fire or flood, will certainly prepare us well to be able to work with those communities in an expeditious way. So we're not dealing with, you know, thinking about the less than ideal ways in which COVID was managed in some communities where change was superimposed on communities. I'm thinking of particularly cultural communities from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It wasn't always done very well. And when there's a lot of consequences associated with that, and indeed mental health consequences where people are incredibly traumatised by this. And it was done in the guise of, this is a public health issue, we need to roll this out with a steamroller, without perhaps some foresight about the consequences long-term on mental health and well-being for those communities who are now grappling with poor well-being, poor mental health issues, with limited access to those resources to cope with the sequelae associated with those traumatic experiences.
And you make a really good point there about the importance of relationships underpinning and the establishment of the relationships underpinning planning efforts and coordination efforts, alongside obviously evaluation sits on that journey too. I'm really interested in Skye. We've spoken a lot about First Nations communities and how evaluative thinking sits behind a lot of the process and has a long history within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. I'm really interested in your views on what we can learn about evaluating resilience through some of those more traditional ways of sense making that exist within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Sorry, Mel. I think that there's, I mean, not to name up specific things, because there are a number of communities who actually are doing this already in very specific ways, and it's not necessarily my story to share. But there are some communities who are working in ways to try and demonstrate resilience that come through processes like connecting back to country, rejuvenating country, that connecting back to culture and learning more about their culture and their history of that place, by building leadership within a particular organisation or leadership around a particular community. So they're starting to do some of those things already. And, you know, a specific program that I'm thinking of at this point is the Healthy Communities program that is being delivered by VATSHO across a number of Aboriginal communities in Victoria. And I think this will not surprise too many people, but the way that that funding was delivered was that the funding was handed over to those community controlled organisations to say, actually, what is it that you need to be a healthy community? And those community organisations designed the programs that were tailored and met the needs of their community at that point in time. And they've since gone through a process of doing a social return on investment. They started using impact yarns, which is the tool I mentioned before. And then in that process, they've gathered the stories. A lot of that work was already being done in the programs that they were delivering, which is not surprising. But a lot of that work was brought through into impact yarns. There was a little bit more that was kind of learnt and heard at that point in time. And then we went through a process of doing the social return on investment stuff. So I think Impact led that piece of the work. But the community organisations were involved and led every step of the way in terms of like even doing ratios and deciding what's the most important, in valuing the outcomes that were determined, in creating a shared kind of theory of change of like what makes a healthy community. And so they were applying all different things that met the needs of their community in different ways. And they've evaluated the types of resilience, or they've evaluated resilience in their kind of way. And that's just by doing the things that came really naturally, like photos, songs, stories, videos. One is a possum skin cloak, which is absolutely amazing. So it's demonstrating what is it when we're coming back together when we're connecting back with who we are and where we come from in our history. And those are the things that are also going to take us forward. And so that connection has been kind of really strong in that evaluation. And I think they'll be presenting, I know that we mentioned the AES, the conference next week. So they'll be presenting next week around their work that they've been doing in evaluating resilience and building healthy communities in Victoria. So it'd be worth touching base and looking out for that one if anyone's going.
Thanks so much, Skye. Molly, did you want to contribute as well there? I'm conscious that you work with a number of communities across the northern side of New South Wales. Really interested in your views.
I have to admit that yeah, there's probably not a lot I can add. I think that was an amazing insight into a really productive and community-based way of delivering programs and funding. Sorry, and I'm in a club here, so there's a lot of background noise. But one thing that I did just want to flag as well, and it sort of picks up from the point that I made earlier about having to deliver a statewide set of programs or a statewide evaluation framework, but really making sure that we make space for the locally led, locally focused work to really shine through. And I think it would be a stretch to call it, place-based, but looking at making sure that whatever we do, there's consistency so we can see the outcomes across the state or across a flood affected area, which at the moment is, pretty much all of the East Coast, down to Wollongong and quite a bit more of the state as well. What is it that we want to see in terms of outcomes across the board without losing sight of those local interventions, the locally led pieces of work, the community efforts, and whatever else it is that makes up that mosaic of recovery, so that each gets to be represented. And I guess, a couple of fairly basic ways, but that are working, that we do that is around our program logic work, is to really make sure that we're picking up the range of outcomes that are that we're working towards. And we're also trying to use more and more existing research and things like the Disaster Resilience Index, so that we can rely on existing data and modelling, because in as much as we want to represent local ideas and local efforts, we also, particularly in a disaster, in the aftermath of a disaster, don't want to then turn to the community and say, well, it's also your job to tell us what you need, when you need it by, and what the outcomes will be. If they're in a place to do that, amazing. But generally speaking, there's a lot more on the priority list, and so making sure that we can, I guess, pre-populate as much as possible using existing data, so that we can support those communities to make space for themselves, but also not to carry all the weight or the responsibility of the recovery journey for themselves.
Kathy, did you
just thinking in our spaces that it's a very similar approach, and we don't want the burden of responsibility on the person that's in that situation. And often, if you ask people, sometimes even doing needs assessment, like what do you need at this moment, they won't know. It's very hard when you're in a crisis situation. So that's why it's even more important to do this sort of preventative focus and try and get in when people aren't in crisis, and strengthen communities so that they are connected and they have this preparedness, if you like, to deal with situations. It doesn't have to be a crisis. It can have, it's just pulling together in times when things get a bit tough too. It doesn't have to be, right, to this level of crisis that we have to get in. I mean, that's when the immediate thing comes, and I think we string to the, if you like, the saviour thing where we come in and say, you need to do this, we need to do that, and we have to do that because we know that, it's a safety thing that helps. as well. So how do we get in early? How do we get in and prevent these things and strengthen communities so they have a say in what happens to them? And yeah, that's sort of what Molly's saying. She's doing. She's on the ground trying to work, and they're on those situations. But I think, you know, two things that you've mentioned there too as well have been, you know, using this logic sort of model approach, you know, and actually capturing what's happening, looking at the data that you're collecting on the ground at this time, and actually, you know, doing that modelling and predictive sort of thing, and using the research to think, what can we do? What, you know, and then we shape it. You know, we have to work with the context and try and see, okay, here's the core. This is what we think is going to work. Do you think this will work in your situation? And trying to apply it in those different spaces. I think it's really important work. And it can be costly, and it can be very time-consuming. And we have 3 years to do it before the government changes again. You know, like this sort of thing happens, you know. So yeah, it's really, you know, it's like saying this work is really important. It's long term. We need to invest in this. We need to do it. But hey, do it quickly, get it done, and you've got 3 years. We want the outcome. You know, like it's this ambiguous sort of space that we work in. Yeah.
And it's a really good point around thinking about, you know, how you work times with the crisis and there's no crisis, before the crisis, to understand what's important to them and what those signs of flourishing are for them as well, so that we're capturing the right things when we are tracking progress over time. And did you have views on that too?
Just wanted to add, I think we need to recognise that there are some families, communities who are in constant crisis, you know, and there's no let up, no respite from those crises. And I think it can be difficult to work with families who are in communities that are in constant crisis, but it's no brainer working where they are at, being where they are at, and working with them when there's nothing to work on as well. So they know that you're a constant in their world. You're not just coming to them when you need them. And just related to the relationship building, and again, a no-brainer, but being in the School of Business, change management is my thing, or one of the areas that I teach and research in. And again, no-brainer, but regular communication. And I think as evaluators, researchers more broadly, I don't think we as a community do that well enough. It's at the risk of sounding controversial, there's often like this rape and pillage mentality. I get the data, I run away, and I do stuff with it, and I report on it via outputs that you probably won't see. But I think we have a responsibility as evaluators to make sure that information goes back to those communities regularly in different formats, not just in written form, for instance, in different formats. And communication, I think, is an important part of this process, and I can't overemphasise this, because the next time we go back to those communities and say, hey, we want to do this project, do you want to work with us? Why would they bother if they didn't understand the benefits of what we did first time around? If they didn't see the outputs, they didn't see what came from that project. So I think going back to those communities regularly to better understand what is the best way to communicate findings from the project, the data from that project, and again, the accountability, the transparency. How can we make this data be meaningful for you? What format would you like it in? Are there agendas that you could use this for? And then working with those communities to ensure that what you're producing is indeed benefit for you, to benefit for them as much as you and the masters that we're playing to ensure reciprocity in that relationship.
That's a very good point, and we actually discussed about a question about how can we communicate the findings to the community. That's one of the questions that we were putting together in this session as well. So that's great that you raised that. So the last question we have before we open up to you guys. So it's just very quickly, how can we work more effectively with different communities to build resilience? And I'm going to start with you, Kathy. Your views on this point.
I think we have to realise that communities are very, very different. That, you know, we have, you know, just look at Sydney itself. If you drive from one side of Sydney to the other, you're going to pass through several different communities. So the actual concept of community can be on very many levels, I guess. You can have small, suburbs, you can have local government areas, you can build into, cities and regional areas, rural areas. So I think we have to realise they're all very different. And I think, you have to look at them and really start to unpack what's happening for those communities. And I think what we're realising more and more in our research when we're starting in this sort of participatory approach or with co-design and things like that, and it's something I learned as a teacher, was to do our sort of situational analysis to really get to know what's written about your community or the community that you're looking at. What's already been done? What have they been asked? what are the facts? What's the ABS got on them? All those sorts of things. Get a really clear picture of the people in those communities and who you're talking about, because it's no good going in there and thinking this is a really culturally diverse community if it's not. You've got to really understand who are the people. And I think, again, it's going back to that relationship stuff. Really, really looking at what's going on in that community and look at some of the things. We always get the clipboard out and go and stand at the local station or the park and talk to parents and families and, elderly walking around and have a discussion with them around what's happening in your community. What do you like? What don't you like? And they're really basic stuff, but you can get such a wealth of information from those sorts of things. So I guess it's starting at the basics. Go back to the grassroots and have a bit of it on the ground. Go and sit in a park and watch what happens. Watch people walking past and see what's going on in those communities. I think we lose touch, and I think it's really easy to do that when you're gathering lots of things and going back, as Anne said, and trying to work out what's going on. But you've got to remember that whatever we're doing needs to go back to the community. It needs to go back and it has to work in that space. So you really have to develop an understanding of what you're doing, who you're doing it for in the end. And if it's really for community, then you have to have an understanding of that space.
Well, I think the answer was partly in the question, that is the word with. So I think whatever we do, it needs to be with communities as opposed to on these communities, on individual, on the organisations that we're working with. It needs to be with. And I think as part of that, and thinking about some of the projects we're working on as part of Teach, for instance, it's about working with those communities in the ways that they prefer. So as an example of what I mean, we've certainly worked with consumers and clinicians as well and managers as co-researchers. So for instance, if there's an interest in capacity building, to use that off-cited term, but particularly with research skills, and if there are individuals who, as part of their position description, are, and they need to be doing evaluation but not sure how, or supposed to be doing quality assurance but a bit uncomfortable about it or what to do, how to do it, working with them on a project together then provides them with the skills that will have benefit post-project going forward. Then they can see value in the relationship that they've developed with you. But I think it needs, I guess, going back to that word with, I think that's the crux here.
Okay, great. And Skye, Molly, do you want to have a say as well?
Molly, feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to say something, but it'll only be brief. I promise. So I just wanted to reflect that, again, in an ideal world, we wouldn't always be doing work that was in response to a disaster, but that's where we are right now. So, a really significant flooding event in February and another significant flooding event in June, July, in some areas being hit twice. One thing that I think we've done better and that we've learned from earlier this year, and we've changed the way that we work somewhat in relation to the most recent event in June, July, is to put more trust and ownership and leadership in the organisations and the people who are already within the community. And again, it's not rocket science, but I think particularly in an agency that has responsibility around emergency management and response, we are fixers, we are doers. We want to get in there and respond to the crisis. And so stepping back and saying, well, you know, there are a lot of really strong, you know, there might be hyperlocal or micro NGOs, or they might be big organisations, or they might be the local council, or there might be a group of individuals who are really well placed to either run programs and interventions themselves, or to be our conduit into the community as well. So I think that's something that about letting go, and it's about making space for other people to solve the problem as well. And so I think that, but that's something that we've been very conscious of trying to do more and more, and to learn from, because again, and it speaks to that relationship and trust that I think every other panelist has spoken to as well.
Thanks, Molly. I'm going to probably end with something that is a little bit different from everyone else. When we spoke about, you know, looking for what already exists within the data, the story, you know, for First Nations communities is that what exists within the data is a deficit discourse around Aboriginal people, Aboriginal community, and it fails to show the strengths of people. And so if we keep looking at the data to tell the picture about us, it's never going to keep telling that true picture. So a lot of the work that we try and focus on is how do we understand exactly what you're saying, like how do you listen to community? And Molly, you'd mentioned before about understanding what are some of the consistent outcomes that would keep kind of coming up. One of the things that we've tried to explore is how can you do rapid evaluation in terms of like community-led change where it's not relying on those data sets that don't tell the right picture, but they're quite useful for other elements like accountability, back to government or back to others when you're trying to, you know, advocate for change. But how do we understand if the work that we're doing at a local level is really driving the things that we need to see? And so we've started asking and testing ideas around, well, if we have these kinds of outcomes that have been determined by the community, what are the things that you could see, hear, feel, sense, know as a collective of community members if those things were being achieved? And so listing those things, and really simply, then the community have their own scorecard, right? Like how do they just look at their scorecard at any point in time and go, what's going on in our community right now? What do we see around us? Are there more families having picnics in the park? Are there, you know, more children playing soccer of a weekend? You know, whatever the things are that they're talking about are building resilience. Like they're the indicators. The things that build resilience are the indicators. So I think I agree, like the deep listening, but for the most part, some data sets don't necessarily tell the story of community, but there are people doing really good work to try and shift that. And I think one of the examples that we've seen at a national level is the Mike Wise study that Ray Lovett's been leading out of Australian National University. And so it's kind of like census, I guess, for Aboriginal people. And it's very strengths based. It talks about the things that really do underpin resilience, and they touch on the elements and the things that exist in culture and Aboriginal community life that have got us to a point that we're still here today. So I think that's one of those really valuable ones that's helpful, like, and lots of great things there in terms of like building community knowledge around gathering data, using data, things like that. And one of the other things that we're trying to do in terms of impact measurement and evaluation is to just raise that voice of Aboriginal people who are participating in this space and feel confident to step into this space. Sorry, I'll add the ANU name in the chat. I'm like looking at both things. So one of the things that we've been fortunate enough to do is to take a cohort of 50 Aboriginal people to the AES conference next week, where we will be together, we will connect, we'll, you know, strengthen our understanding of what is impact measurement, what is evaluation, what does it look like, particularly from a Western sense, what is best practice that's being showcased, and then what are the things within that that make good sense to us? What are some of the parts that we could decolonize, and how do we support each other and support our communities to start stepping in and leading in the spaces as opposed to being evaluated or being researched. like we have these really great skills and hundreds of thousands of years of history where we've used evaluative thinking to get us to this point. So we've got a lot to offer. So it's more about confidence building. So I think there's a lot of, mine was probably a little bit different to what everyone else had to say. But I think there's some great stuff there. And I'm going to respond to the chat about the micro study. I'll put some links in.
Thank you so much, Skye. Now I'm conscious that we are running slightly close to time. We'll continue the conversation though. If those of you want to stick around, please do. Eleanor, I know we've had a lot of chat questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to choose a couple. I know it's a lot of pressure to choose.
So I'm going to choose a question, and I'll direct them to the online panelists because I'm imagining that you will have to go sooner rather than later. But we have one from, well, sort of a hybrid of two questions that I have created. So it's from Stuart and Jenny, and I'm going to direct it to Molly. So research and evaluation is about learning more about the factors behind a situation. And so do you have any thoughts on the ways evaluators can work with the flexibility and some of the approaches that we've sort of discussed or have been advocated for this evening, when sometimes the funds are tied to a specific incident, for example, a flood, but the root causes the evaluation is uncovering are far more complex and deeper than that. So I guess maybe Molly, if you could comment on that, and we'll go to the others.
Question, and I did see Stuart's comment in the chat, so thank you for that. And I think it points to a really significant challenge that we have touched on, which is around, funding being either tied to timing or to particular events, and, having to mould the program or the intervention or the support to that rather than the other way around, which would be really ideal. So I think that there's a few ways that we can influence that or change that using evaluation. None of it is rapid, but that's okay, it's worth doing. So for example, really using evaluation and outcomes and particularly qualitative feedback to influence those decision makers around funding, I think is something that we do let's be honest, probably more week to week, with some of our funding partners and co-contributors to highlight what's missing, what could be better, different models and those sorts of things. So that's one way, which is a slow burn. The other part, which resilience as a whole, and particularly my team is looking at, is really pivoting away from that response and recovery arena and working more and more in the prevention and preparedness space, because there's a different way of funding and supporting those sorts of activities. Well constructed, a business case around or a value for money narrative around that is really powerful and really strong about preparing communities rather than responding after an event. And again, it's about using really carefully constructed evaluation to highlight some of those findings, which we think are buried in there, but may not have been drawn out, and making sure that, again, that those audiences who make decisions about where funding goes, how long it goes for, where resources can be directed, are really conscious of and clear on those findings. And there's a lot of convincing to be done, but I think it's something that we're very committed to doing so. And Stuart, I'm happy to speak to you specifically about that $5 million program, which has, we can maybe have an offline dialogue about that. And I think we're about to have a fire alarm.
Thank you so much, Molly, for joining us. I'll open to the room for a question or two before we then close up, and obviously we can continue the conversation over drinks in this room, but I would like to give people an opportunity to speak to the panel, and there's a hand at the back.
Hi, there's a couple of things that have been touched on, but I'd be really interested to hear from the panel a bit more. And you spoke about the importance of feedback, but one of the things that hasn't really come out is the issue around being honest around what can be achieved from that process. Rarely can you actually, people articulate their problems, but rarely can you deliver on any of them immediately. And even less can you deliver on all of them. And that issue around honesty to me is absolutely critical in terms of the integrity of the work. And the second issue, and again, it's been touched on, is the diversity within our community and the need to recognise, not just within our Indigenous community, but the broader community, that it is not monolithical, and that there are groups within it, and Catherine, you were sort of alluded to it, groups within it who are coming from very different backgrounds. And a lot of my work is with refugees who are not going to respond all that well to the government coming and asking them what it is are the issues for them, or even to academics who have been to a large extent associated with perpetrators of torture or violence against them. So the importance, I'd love you to unpack a bit more about the issue of honesty of outcome, and secondly, how do we effectively work within our very diverse community.
Can I just take the first point?
So you can have the first one, the second one.
I guess it goes without saying, the honesty goes without saying, because it's pivotal to trust, it's pivotal to relationships. And I think by exposing, one way, the key way to build trust is by exposing your vulnerabilities, right? In a reciprocal way, and I imagine, and if you reflect on both your personal and professional relationships, in what helped you to build trust with someone, I imagine it was those pivotal moments when vulnerabilities to some degree were exposed. And I think I often see this, and I'm just thinking of the work that we're currently doing with regard to co-designed approaches, and often we see co-design being bantered around, and it means different things to different people. Sometimes it's mere consultation, other times it's in the truest sense of the term co-design, but typically you don't often hear about the parameters around what can be co-designed and what can't. And I think it sets an expectation among the co-designers that sky's the limit. We know the skies are not the limits. There are funding issues, there are timeframe implications, there's access to limited expertise or skills, for instance. And I think if people in the room have been part of co-design processes, I'm sure you've been to some degree, or they call them self-co-design, but think about whether or not that started with, these are the parameters, this is the sandpit that we're in, we can't go outside the sandpit, the parameters here, this is what we're working with. Often it's done with this idea that we can come up with anything, and you often see it bleed into different, in the rhetoric that's often used. So again, thinking about healthcare space, for instance, and you often hear about patient-centric approaches. Similarly, there's an upper limit to that. You can't ask for caviar when you go to a public hospital. Well, I haven't tried, but I imagine my request won't be obliged. But in other words, there's an upper limit to how centric a patient-centric approach can be. And similarly, I don't think we're transparent enough about what the conditions are. And I think that's part of the problem with setting parameters or limits to the trust building exercises, because we're not honest enough in those processes. So I completely agree.
Skye, I can see you nodding on that too. Did you want to add there?
There's so many things to comment on, but I agree, like trust underpins pretty much everything. And in the work that we do, if we want open responses, if we want good evidence, really, at the end of the day, then we must have trust. A lot of the tools that are kind of being thrown around in terms of how we evaluate resilience are not the types of things that build trust. They're the types of things that get surface level responses, or a nod and a smile and a polite go away. Like these, that takes more than that. So I agree with you. I think, it's really important to name it up. And I think we've kind of skirted around it. But yeah, I agree. It requires trust humility, openness, honesty, sharing your whole self, bringing, you know, everything about you into this space to connect with another person. And I think, yeah, often we take that for granted, but some of us are wearing our work hat and some of us are bringing different things to different spaces. And so, yeah, really, it sets the conditions, I think, for, you know, everything beyond that point of engagement.
I guess one of the other things we could add in the research space is that we have to go through a very stringent ethical process before we even get to speak to anybody. And in going through that process, those very things are touched on. What's the benefit? You know, how are you feeding back? All those things come out in our ethics, and you know, we often have to answer again when you know, in that process about, you know, you've said this, but it's not really explained very well. So I think, you know, and we go through, you know, we work with children, so we have, you know, even more stringent sort of ethical processes that we have to go through. So I guess that's a really good, for us, you know, like I guess a benchmark, if you like, or something that actually keeps us on it, that makes us think about that, you know, when we're going in, we have to explicitly put that in our consent forms. And we have to explain that, and we have to have informed consent when we're doing research with groups. Now, not everybody has to adhere to that, and I think some of the things that restrict us as researchers going into communities is some of the very poor practices that have gone before us. When we have to go in and repair damage, and I've worked in several communities when I've actually had to sit with people and rebuild relationships. They don't even know me, but I'm already judged by what previous people have done with them. And it breaks my heart sometimes to sit in those spaces and do that. And it takes me much, much longer to build that trust again and repair some of that damage. And yeah, but we get there in the end. And, you know, it's because of the, I guess, you know, the honesty and the upfrontness, if you like, in that space of, you know, I can ask you what you want, but I can't always deliver. But we can talk about it and we can work on ways of doing that. And, you know, Molly's touched on the way of, you know, we can get evidence. You know, we can look at this. One of the very, very early projects that I worked on was with an Aboriginal community. They were experiencing cot death, SIDS, you know, and they were saying, we want to do something about this, you know, we're losing some of our children. And so we sat, we yarned, we talked for ages, we looked at what we could do. And it was actually, you know, there was no evidence in that community. And so we actually started to collect data around that so that they could strengthen the case. They were talking and talking and asking, but nothing was being done. The data is hard to refute when it's collected well. And so a lot of my time has been spent in communities where I've done work like that, is actually working on one part to do some of that prevention sort of thing and working with them and capacity building, as Anne said. But on another side of it is actually saying, what's the data you're collecting? How are you collecting it? You know, what are the guidelines you're using to collect that? Are you making people aware of how you're using that data? Are you feeding back to them about what you're collecting? And I think Molly touched on this really well, really earlier on, about saying we make ourselves redundant. So, you know, going in as researchers, my greatest, you know, benefit to me is seeing people doing my job. And that sounds stupid. You know, why would I want to do myself out of a job? But seeing a community take on what I do and do it for themselves is like, it's like raising children, it's like teaching in the classroom. It's the light bulb moment when someone can take what you've taught them and apply it in their context and do well with it, that inspires me to keep going. And working with families and children that have really complex issues and needs, if you like, can be marvellous to see them coping and doing well when they've built that capacity to actually self-manage. And that's what we're ultimately trying to do with communities. We want them to self-manage, not take responsibility in that way that we're just burdening them with it. We actually want them to have everything they need to be able to manage what's happening for them in those spaces, providing everything, the resources, the skills, the support when they need it. And I think that's really important.
So I'm conscious that we didn't respond to your second question about
diversity.
Diversity, and I'm very conscious about the power of language. And I was reminded about this just recently, working with different communities who are culturally and linguistically diverse. And using, I guess, government rhetoric in terms of, the acronym COLD. And there was one respected member of this cultural community and sort of took a step back and said, what are we, cold? Are we indifferent? Is that what you're saying about us, And I think so language is incredibly powerful. And we need to be mindful about the labels that we use. And I appreciate that, when in Rome, so for instance, you might use the language of government, for instance, in policies and the like, but it may not be fit for purpose and may be very disengaging to some of the community you're trying to work with and establish relationships. But also, as you rightly said, recognising the diversity even within the same cultural community as well, and not assuming that because I'm working with the Ghanaian community, for instance, or the Bhutanese community, that they're all the same. It's certainly not the same at all. I think particularly working what I found helpful, cultural leaders, community leaders in those groups to be guided by their expertise, and taking paying heed to their advice. You're less likely to go wrong when you're respecting their advice and taking being guided by their advice.
It's such a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could stay here all night talking about this. I know there's been a lot of light bulb moments probably for everyone in the room, but certainly, for us as evaluators, when we think about our work, a lot of the conversation today is really call for action for us to think when we are undertaking evaluation work, when we're working with communities, when we're building relationships, reflecting on how we're doing that in ways that empower. And to your point, Kathy, seeing ourselves out of jobs, empowering those who we are working with and for to really take that work and move forward themselves in defining what resilience looks like for them in their communities and seeing them thrive. So thank you all so much for your time. I want to take a moment to thank the panel. Thank you, Skye, Molly, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Kathy. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'd also like to thank some of my team members, Charmaine in particular, who all of you have interfaced with as you've been registering, has done a lot of work behind the scenes as well. And thank you to the organising committee. So thank you, Eleanor, for fielding some of those questions just now, and to Paula as well, my co-host. For those of you in the room, we'd really encourage you to stay on. We have some drinks here if you'd like to stay and continue the conversation. Thank you all on the line as well for joining. I will just let you know that the video, so there was a note on the chat before we started recording that this video of the recording for today will be shared too. So if you weren't able to make the whole session, for those of you on the line, or if you've got colleagues who weren't able to join, feel free to share the link as well. There's also a link to a Menti, which you can use to evaluate the session. So we have a survey that we'd love some feedback on too. I think one of my team members will screen share in a moment so that you can scan that QR code and then fill in that survey too. But thank you all so much. It's been a great conversation and we're really looking forward to continuing it. Please join me. Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, we're in charge of
Feeling it?
no, because
They'll still be on the floor, which won't be.